Friends, ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to welcome you to Somerville on a Sunday afternoon. This is our first literary tea for some time, thanks to COVID, so it's fabulous to have everybody together. And we are so very, very fortunate this afternoon to welcome two superstars. I'm going to read this. Oh, sorry, you couldn't hear me. Could you hear me earlier? Anyway, Professor Emma Smith, Oxford's Professor of Shakespeare Studies and a particular authority on the first folio and on our relationship with books. Well, hell, including her latest book, Portable Magic. And then a Tony and Olivier award-winning actor, Sir Simon Russell Beale, who, as we know, is an extraordinary Shakespearean, an amazing actor, and he has had a huge variety of Shakespearean roles, including Macbeth, Leontes, Prospero, Richard II, and he did a star turn in the BBC's Hollow Crown series of adaptations as Falstaff. Whoa. Anyway, before we listen to these two extraordinary people, I'm going to ask my colleague and friend Fiona Stafford to come and say a few words, because as many of you will know, our former professor, emeritus professor, Katherine Duncan-Jones, sadly died a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed very appropriate on an afternoon when we're thinking about Shakespeare that we should remember her and pay tribute to her, and there could be no one better to do that than Professor Fiona Stafford. Fiona, over to you.
Well, welcome to everybody. When I was asked to say a few words about Katherine Duncan-Jones, I thought, I need to say more than a few words. So what I decided to do, because I think a lot of people in the room will remember Katherine very fondly and all have their own special memories of her, so I didn't want to impose too many of mine. What I thought was really in the spirit of Katherine was to take a leaf out of her own book, because at the end of her wonderful biography, which many of you will have read, Gentle Shakespeare, which was published in 2001, just at the time when she retired, she took early retirement from her tutorial fellowship at Somerville, so this has been much in my mind. And at the end of the book, her epilogue, having researched Shakespeare's life in great detail, she ends by emphasising the importance of reading him. And she says about Shakespeare that it's through his words, it's here that the best of him is to be found. So I thought, in which case, what I should say about Katherine is to let her speak for herself. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the epilogue of this, if you'll give me a bit of time to do that, because she's also talking about the publication of the first folio, which of course we're going to hear more about. And this is what she says, and this is very, very characteristic of Katherine, I think, in lots of ways, because she is. It comes from her great knowledge of Shakespeare, her scholarly interest in the reception of Shakespeare, her interest in the Bodleian and physical copies of his work. But it also is very characteristic in that it's kind of delivering a couple of rebukes to the university as well. You can tell the way she emphasises the fact that the people reading the first folio were all men, that she's making a point there. And then she has a couple of points to make about the Bodleian, Sir Thomas Bodley and the early curator. So I'll just read you this little bit, and then I'm going to hand straight over to Emma and Simon. So here we are. So she's talking about this first copy, and she says, we know that at least one body of young men who were lucky enough to enjoy free access to a fine copy of the folio availed themselves liberally of this opportunity. These were Oxford undergraduates who'd achieved the privilege of reading in the Bodleian Library. A groundbreaking agreement between the Bodleian and the Stationers' Company in 1611 ensured that one perfect copy of every book published under their jurisdiction should be given to the Bodleian, even though neither the library's founder, Sir Thomas Bodley, nor its first librarian, Thomas James, were at all well disposed towards such light literature as playbooks. The agreement ensured that a mint copy of the 1623 folio was promptly delivered, being sent by the librarian to an Oxford bookbinder, William Wildgoose, in February 1624. Once returned, the book was chained to a shelf in the part of Duke Humber's library known as Art's End, by means of a clip through its front cover. Young men at Oxford during the reign of Charles I perused the volume with such enthusiasm that parts of some pages were entirely worn away by the friction of their hands and elbows, despite the unusually high quality of the crown paper on which it was printed. This provides a unique early record of the relative popularity of Shakespeare's plays among exactly the kind of young men who had been his greatest fans at the turn of the 16th century. Just like those Elizabethan students, these Caroline ones, because of course Charles I had just come to the throne, most admired Shakespeare as a poet of love. They voted with their elbows for Romeo and Juliet, as far and away their favourite play, and the balcony scene as far and away their favourite passage. Parts of the facing leaf where many arms rested have vanished altogether. The second most popular play was not Hamlet, which one might have imagined would appeal to university students, but Julius Caesar. This play's depiction of an overweening ruler who is assassinated by his own friends and advisors probably seemed grippingly topical in the years leading up to the execution of Charles I. Overall, it seems the tragedies were most read and the histories least. Least popular of all was King John. But the whirligig of time brought in its revenges. Soon after the publication of the third folio in 1663-4, the curators of the Bodleian voted unanimously to sell the library's much-read first folio, presumably because they regarded it as now superseded. No record of a Bodleian copy of the second folio has ever been found, so that edition may have been immediately sold by order of the then curators in order to discourage further time wasting on what Sir Thomas Bodley had called baggage books by Oxford undergraduates. However, and this is where it all twists, in 1905, a gentleman from Derbyshire, Mr. G.M.R. Turbot, brought a badly damaged copy of the first folio along to the library for an expert opinion. It was quickly recognised that the binding was an Oxford one, and that the wanderer from the shelves had revisited its old home. A major fundraising campaign was launched among Oxford alumni to buy the volume back for £3,000, matching the amount being eagerly offered by a rival purchaser in America. This is 1905, remember. The appeal was successful, and the Bodleian folio was at last brought back to the Bodleian Library. And then, this is very Catherine, though the University of Oxford made belated reparation for what now looks like extraordinary folly on the part of the Bodleian's curators in the Restoration period, they purchased her honour at a very high price. So, thank you very much. That's Catherine in her own words.
I want to say something a little bit about Katherine Duncan-Jones. I didn't really know her very well, but through my association with this, my happy association with this college, I was filming here, doing the Falstaff that Jan mentioned in the thing called the Hologram, and we were filming in a quad in, you call them quads, don't you? Yeah, a quad in New College, and my sister-in-law Lisa, who works here, said to Katherine Duncan-Jones, "Oh, my brother-in-law's filming here," and I thought, "Oh, would she like to come along?" So I sent her an invitation, and Catherine spent the whole day in a tent. I remember we built her a tent. And she sat in state in the middle of on the grass. And I sat by, we were obviously allowed to walk on the grass, but and I sat by her for the whole day dressed as Falstaff. And anyway, she was absolutely enchanting. And I remember I think, I mean, Emma probably will correct me on this, she was one of that sort of handful, Emma preeminent among them, of those writers who can write about Shakespeare for the general public completely readably. And I'd read her Ungentle Life, and I think I remember her saying this little argument. She said, "Why is it always assumed that Shakespeare, who started life as an actor, was a bad actor?" Do you remember this? Or a mediocre actor? We know, as you know, that he was reputed to have played certain parts, like the ghost of Hamlet's father and Adam in As You Like It. But anyway, it was always assumed that he was probably a bit dodgy on the acting thing, and so went into writing. And And that shows all sorts of snobberies because, anyway, Catherine said to me, I wonder whether he played Falstaff. I mean, I know we think Will Kemp did, but she had this idea on this grass, and it's probably in the book. And I thought, isn't it fascinating that over the 40 years I've been an actor, the relationship actors now have with academics is much healthier and much more constant than it was when I started, because there was a mutual suspicion, even in the 1980s, between academics and actors. And I've always thought the reason why Shakespeare was always regarded as a bad actor was because the idea of the man of the millennium, as he was voted in 2000, being an actor at all was too horrifying for English amour propre. And so therefore the great genius of our literary canon couldn't possibly have been also a good actor. So I thought Catherine was on my side on that one, that there's nothing wrong with a good actor.
Well, Catherine taught me, as many of the people in this room, and yeah, there's lots I would want to say. I think the thing that she most taught me, possibly not when I was an undergraduate, but maybe since, was to ask those questions, that there's room to ask questions again about things that look quite settled, and what a lot of Shakespeare studies, what a lot of Shakespeare apparent facts really are resting on not very much at all. And that the example of Shakespeare's acting career is a really good one. There's no reason to believe that he was a poor actor, and in fact there's every reason to believe that he was a good one. Otherwise he would have not been admitted to this small company of actors who are not going to carry a bad actor. That's just not feasible. But she had that ability to look again, and the tenacity to follow those things up. It's a great introduction, though, actually, to what we're talking about, because one argument about this book, the first folio, the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays, which comes out posthumously in 1623, one argument about that book is that it begins, or really consolidates, the move of Shakespeare's plays away from the theatre, so that this is an expensive book. Folio refers to a size of book, so it's a big wodge of a book, a kind of atlas or law book or Bible size. It's a book you would have in your study, not in your pocket. So it's a book that already suggests in its format a particular kind of formality and seriousness in how you would approach it. And it's a book which has very little reference to the theatre directly in it. There are a few bits and pieces that we'll talk about, but what one suggestion is, this is a big attempt to take Shakespeare back from the sort of slightly lowbrow, more than slightly, the very lowbrow stage, and to bring him into the study, into the kind of literary canon. And we have all probably, whether we are students of English literature or not, suffered from that move, that Shakespeare is something that you have to take really, really seriously.
Can I ask about, we ought to do a little potted history of how it was created, but you have the earlier editions of Shakespeare, the quartos, some of which were extremely popular and often read, presumably in the study. So presumably a culture of buying these books to go and read back at home already existed, didn't they?
Definitely. So Shakespeare,
very popular ones like the Henry IV plays, the Falstaff plays.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
Falstaff plays.
Absolutely. So they're being read, exactly. They're being read, but they're being sold in these kind of, what are effectively pamphlets, which are a different kind of portable reading that you can sort of take around with you. Whereas the folio needs a proper library, wedge to prop it up on. Otherwise, you won't be able to read it. So it's got a kind of stasis around it, which adds to its formality. But yeah, half of Shakespeare's plays had already been printed.
Can you tell? Let's do a potted history of the book itself. So how did it come together? In 5 minutes.
Less than 5 minutes. I think we've begun this afternoon by saying, you know, how important and wonderful it is to challenge received wisdom. There are lots of ways received wisdom makes it easier to tell a story quickly, but there are lots of things we don't know about how the first folio was put together. So we don't know. There is an epistle to it, a dedicatory epistle, signed by two actors in The King's Men, John Hemming and Henry Condell, and we know that 7-8 years previously, Hemmings and Condell, together with Richard Burbage, perhaps the most famous actor of that troupe, had been given money in Shakespeare's will to buy mourning rings, a very standard way of getting people to remember you. And one suggestion is that the commission to Hemmings and Condell was actually to do something more to remember their friend, and to do that by gathering together the works that
where would that commission come from?
Well, from Shakespeare himself.
From Shakespeare.
Who knows whether Shakespeare was interested in doing that? We don't know. Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's sort of rival come friend, maybe we've all got somebody like that in our lives, his rival, Jonson had just published in the year of Shakespeare's death a folio volume of his own works, and that may have given Shakespeare and the people around him a kind of nudge.
Jonson was mocked, wasn't he, for start calling them works, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it seemed to be pretentious to be taking this lowbrow literary form,
yes,
and turning it into art.
But also saying, yeah, you're right, your plays are works.
Yeah,
it kind of rebounded.
So we don't know where the commission came from, but these two men, close friends, then had to collect the plays together. Half of them were already in print.
Yeah.
So the other half came from?
Must have come from The King's Men. So playwriting in this period is usually commissioned by companies, so the ownership of the script rests with the company, not with the author. So those scripts will have been with the King's Men, and actually are one of the things that's changing about Shakespeare studies is we are increasingly looking at plays which were published for the first time in 1623, but which we think were performed for the first time, say, 1600, and thinking the text that we've actually got is probably later than that earlier date. It's probably something which has been revived as part of the repertory during the 16 teens and 20s, probably after Shakespeare's own writing career. So they got those plays which are not previously published. They negotiate with the stationers who own the copyright to the other plays in order to get them all collected. And crucial to this, there's Hemmings and Condell from the theatre world, and there are two men from the world of print, Isaac Jaggard, who is just on the cusp and then just does inherit his father's printing business in the Barbican. William Jaggard has been a very important, wily publisher in London, and he is coming to the end of his life. So Isaac is a young, ambitious for that business, I think, and I think for him the Shakespeare Folio is a big test of his vision for his business. I'm really fascinated by the way this is a kind of economic issue, and it's an economic issue with lots of people playing into it, not just literary people or theatre people. And a stationer called Edward Blunt. And Blunt is an interesting man because he seems to have had, unlike most publishers in this time the majority of their work is sermons and religious literature, Blunt has really cosmopolitan tastes, literary tastes. So it's Blunt who publishes Don Quixote in English. It's Blunt who publishes Montaigne. So that's an extraordinary, just that kind of backlist is an extraordinary sense of what's being published in Spain and in France respectively. And Blunt, for some reason, maybe it seems obvious with hindsight, but I don't think it seemed obvious at the time, picks Shakespeare to be in this category. So he The stationers are the people who invest in a book, so they have to be sure that it's going to succeed because they've paid out, and they won't get their money back unless it sells. So Blunt, I think, is the person who actually makes this happen by bringing together.
Was there a changing environment in terms of? I mean, I'm fascinated by the idea. In fact, I'm writing a bit about it at the moment about at what point, or whether Shakespeare ever went, I'm really concerned about my name being on the front of my collected works, because we know his name wasn't. They were owned by the company, and his name wasn't on a play script until late 90s, was it? Love's Labour's Lost, I think.
Lost,
yeah. So we have no idea, of course, whether he was concerned at all that his books were printed. So, but was there a change in culture in which people like Johnson went, no, actually this needs to be taken seriously and I need my name on the front? Was it changing?
I think it is changing, and there's definitely a shift towards plays having a certain number of plays having a life in print, which I think again was not inevitable. It does not seem to me natural that you would having a very successful performance culture on the South Bank of the Thames, that you would automatically think what we will spin off from that is published scripts. You know, we don't look at the latest Netflix drama and think this is absolutely fantastic, I must read the screenplay. Success in one format doesn't need to generate a printed text, and it's not clear really that publishers are not very sure what to do with plays. They're not sure whether there's a readership for them. They're not sure whether the readership is people who've been to the play and are sort of predisposed towards it, or the opposite, people who never go to plays but might want to sort of keep an eye on what's happening or might be interested in it. So they have a go. It's very fascinating. They have a go at publishing with these quite different aims. There are 2 editions of Troilus and Cressida in 1609 which are really exemplary on this. One says, this is a play that everybody's loved in the theatre, so you should buy it. The other edition says, this play has never been performed, so it's perfect to be read. And these are marketing. You know, for a long time we thought, how can these both be true? And you think they're both true because it's their marketing. They're both true. They're neither of them probably true.
Was it a success, the Folio, in terms of sales?
Oh God, I mean that's a great question, and it's a really important question, because I think, looking back, we see, we always say, you'll hear this, next year, the 400th anniversary of the Folio, which we are anticipating in a front foot kind of way. You'll hear people saying, if we didn't have this book, we wouldn't have Macbeth, we wouldn't have Julius Caesar, we wouldn't have, Tempest and all of those things. And that is there's an extraordinary counterfactual where we don't have those texts, and if we didn't have them published here, it's pretty clear they would have been lost. So it's hard for us to imagine from our perspective that this didn't just fly off the shelves, and that everybody wasn't just saying, oh God, do you remember that one? It's a long time, isn't it, since we've heard anything about, As You Like It or something. Remember that? Wasn't that a good one? But that doesn't actually necessarily seem to have been the case. So there's a second folio, as you heard Katherine mentioning. Second folio comes out in 1632. So we assume that means the first folio has sold out. So that's 9 years later. So we
know something about the first buyers, don't we? In fact, we know the first. Don't we know the first buyer? Full stop. Isn't there a chap? I can remember from your book. So, isn't the first character?
You just feed me the line, Simon. We do know about we actually do
know the first buyer.
We know about a very, very likeable young man called Edward Deering, who went
on a shopping trip.
He did. History's been a bit cruel to Edward Deering, because more or less the only thing we know about him from this part of his life is his account book. So it is like having your biography written from your credit card statements, where, with the best will in the world, you just look like a kind of flibbertigibbet, don't you? As if all you do is wheel from one emporium to another, buying coffees, buying drinks and so on. And that's a bit what Edward Deering looks like.
Yeah.
But he's redeemed himself
by buying the folio.
Buying the folio, but it's good for the shopaholic that is Edward Derry that he buys too.
Actually, why don't we do the other folios while we're at it? Because you mentioned the second folio,
Okay.
and which we have out there, which is not a particularly distinct difference between the first folio and the second folio. Is that right?
That's pretty much right. I mean, it's been reset, so it's got some improvements and some new errors, which is always the case when you reset anything. One of the things we were just saying before, somebody has gone through with an eye to the Latin, which they don't seem to have done for the first folio. It looks as if nobody in the print shop, in Jaggard's print shop in 1622-3, knew Latin or knew it well enough to think, actually, something's gone a bit wrong here. Whereas somebody does do that for the second folio. And there's a slight bit of slight updating of grammatical forms.
And then we have the third one. Now that is interesting.
Yeah, go on.
Which is I can't do it. I can't do it. 1663.
Yeah,
And the second printing.
you can do it. You can do it, Simon.
The second printing of the third folio has 6 new plays, 8 new plays.
I think it's 7, but yeah.
7. 7 new plays attributed to Shakespeare, only one of which is now confirmed, which is Pericles.
Yeah.
God, you're testing me here. Pericles, which wasn't in the first folio or the second folio, and was co-written anyway with George Wilkins, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Not that that makes any difference, but that was included. But there was 6 others.
It slightly does make a difference because one of the things that maybe the first folio is doing, if you know nothing else about this book, you will be able to picture its title page because of that picture of Shakespeare with the sort of balding head and looking as if his head is sort of slightly on a plate. He's got a kind of square ruff, and this is an engraving done by a refugee engraver called Martin Druschut. If you think it's a good engraving, you say it was Druschut the elder. If you think it's not very good, you say it was Druschut the younger. And he couldn't help himself.
But doesn't Ben Jonson write a poem saying, honestly, if he captured him as well as that portrait, you think you must be joking? I mean,
he can't have seen the portrait.
He can't have seen the
He's
portrait.
Just written
It's the most odd.
Yeah, it is very odd. It's waiting for. I feel as if one of the many spin-offs from the first folio is actually the Monty Python montage, because the head of Shakespeare looks as if it's just about to bounce off somehow in an animated way. So that's a really unusual title page, not just because the engraving is not very good, but because it's an engraving of a person, of a writer. That's not how most books wanted to establish their authority. That volume by Ben Jonson that I just mentioned has a sort of classical architectural frontispiece with the figures of comedy and tragedy in an allegorical way. That's what you did if you were, selling a kind of literary work. So to sell it with the image of the writer, however accurate it was or however well done it was, is itself quite distinct. And there is something going on in the folio about, and that may be also part of the way that you remove plays slightly from the theatrical context and bring them into the literary context, is that you remove the collaborative work that's intrinsic to theatre, and you invent a single author.
Yes.
And the first folio compilers seem to be ambivalent about some of the collaborative material.
And of course, the work over the centuries since has proved that half of them in the original first folio must be collaboration. Well, the early histories.
Yeah, half-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The early ones and the late ones.
Yeah, so I think that's the big thing that's probably been changing over the last 20 years, the extent of Shakespeare's collaborations, either in real time with other writers, or the extent to which the texts that we have of Shakespeare represent perhaps a Shakespearean original overwritten by somebody who is sort of bringing it up to date, refreshing it in some way for a new production.
Can we have examples of that? For instance, Macbeth, you're doing all the work here, which is fine by me.
Wait till we get having a few soliloquies in a minute, so you better clear your throat.
But talk about, let's say, collaboration on the early histories would be a co-writing with somebody like Thomas Nash, isn't he, who you're working on at the moment. But so that's a sort of genuine equal co-writing?
Yeah.
Or would Nash be the senior writer? And,
It's it's been difficult for us to disentangle our own models of collaborative writing, which tend to have perhaps a senior name, or the people who get their names on the credits and then the writer's room behind them or something. It's been hard. It's always hard for us to look back at the past and not be anachronistic because of our own assumptions about how things work. So we don't know whether there was equal collaboration, whether that worked, whether you always had one person who was directing it and saying, you can do this bit and you can do that bit. There are lots of available models, but we don't know how useful they are. Is this the model of the master painter who says, well, I'll do the hands, but you can do the curtain? When it comes to the difficult bits, I'll do that. With a bit of evidence about that, many scholars think, I was just thinking, Katherine did not think this, and actually I think I agree with her, but many scholars, the majority of scholars, think that a speech in an unpublished play called The Book of Thomas More is by Shakespeare, and that looks very much on the model that this is, as it were, the sort of delicate bit of the play which needs an expert to come in, and it's a speech where Thomas More speaks to the rioting Londoners who are basically anti-immigrant, and the More says, imagine what you would feel. How would you feel if the king banishes you for what you've done now, and you have to go as immigrants to somewhere else? Kind of how would you like it?
So this is the handwriting one, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the British Museum. Could there have been adaptations? I'm thinking of Macbeth.
Yeah.
After Shakespeare died, because that's co-writing with Middleton.
Yeah.
So that's a middle period play. We certainly know that Middleton added songs. Is that right?
Yeah.
But could he have actually changed the text that Shakespeare wrote before it was put into the folio?
So there's a cluster of plays. Everybody wants to hear from you, Simon. So I'm not having this.
I'm
We're
really interested.
not continuing like this. We're going to move to Timon of Athens in a minute. So I've given you good warning.
Timon of
I've
Athens,
given you warning. We'll talk about Timon of Athens because that looks like a real-time collaboration with Shakespeare and Middleton sitting together in some way, writing a play together. But these other examples that you're talking about, Macbeth, Measure for Measure, All's Well, possibly others, look like Middleton refreshes of a Shakespeare original. And but it's very difficult to tell that because we don't have the original. And it's difficult to do that in a way that doesn't just say, I don't like this bit, like famously the Hecate or Hecate scenes in Macbeth, which generations of school children have been told they don't need to read because it probably isn't by Shakespeare, and we don't like it. So it's hard for us to get away from thinking, this is not a very good bit, and therefore probably it wasn't by Shakespeare. But instead to think that act of refreshing a play, rebuffing it in some way, was a skill and a sensitive skill which probably playwrights of that period had and could develop. But we're still a little bit unclear what are the tools you would use to disaggregate the different voices in the text and whether that would be the right thing to do. So one very prominent form of scholarship, Shakespearean scholarship at the moment, is sort of digitally aided stylometric analysis. So you say, that there is this likelihood that this kind of configuration of syntactic features belongs to Shakespeare or belongs to Middleton. But it's so complicated that almost nobody can know whether it's true or not true or what it would mean that it was true. But it also seems to me slightly, I feel, to miss the point that I don't think that when we look at a brilliant writing double act in our own time, I think about the sort of pairs of writers who wrote kind of fantastic sitcoms, and we don't tend to look at that and think, well, it's clear, that bit was by X and that bit was by Y. The whole point was that they were more together as a kind of portmanteau writing team than separately. So it's difficult to know about.
Very interesting that question about that sort of knee-jerk thing about, well, this is bad, so it can't have been by Shakespeare. Because I will talk a bit about Timon, because that was a collaboration with Middleton. it's a mess. It's a mess, and its entry into the Folio was a mess because it seems to have been a late edition and it was slipped in the wrong section of the book. Because it's divided into 3 comedies, tragedies, histories, and it's in the wrong section. That's right, isn't it? I think, or it's slipped between 2 sections. Anyway, it's a bit of a mess because there are odd things about it, like the Timon, the hero, dies twice, which is quite tricky to do in the theatre. And the other thing, because I played it in Olympic year at the National Theatre, and it was a sort of challenge. It was like Nick Heitner, who was in charge of the National at the time. We did it as a sort of challenge, see how we can make this play work. And in fact, famous directors like Peter Brook have done the script as it is printed in the Folio. And this raises all sorts of questions about how theatre practitioners react to and use the Folio. But Peter Brook did the whole thing, including the double death. You can make it the same death but reported differently, etc., etc., etc. But we found that we had to do a little bit more work than that. The first half of the play is essentially Middleton, and the second half is essentially Shakespeare. That's roughly. And there's a moment, and if you play Timon, it actually hits you like a punch. There's a moment when suddenly the writing becomes Shakespearean, not Middletonian. But the funny thing is that Middleton writes very well for the theatre, as did Fletcher, another of Shakespeare's collaborators. And there are moments when the emotional impact of a Fletcher line, for instance in Two Noble Kinsmen, when there's a character called the Jailer's Daughter who is essentially written by Fletcher, which has a lovely emotional ease. And it's like a clear channel for the actor to do. It's just a girl in love and losing her mind. Whereas when you get to as you do as well, yes. Whereas when you get to the Shakespeare stuff, it's very, very complicated to do. And there's a moment in Timon when, having lost all his money, he has a very long soliloquy cursing Athenian society, which immediately becomes knotty. And from then onwards, it's knotty Shakespeare. And it's not easy to act, actually. And there's somebody who thinks, in terms of judgment, is the Middleton actually better theatrically than the far more sophisticated Shakespeare? The other little clue, I think, to why it's an unfinished script is that Timon, for the whole second half of the play, does not leave the stage. I guarantee that Shakespeare, as a practical writer for his actors, would have given him a rest. He almost always did. Richard III, I think, is about the only one which is an early play, where he allows the main actor just to go on and on and on, because it is, Lear has his moment when he can just have a sit down before he comes back to do his final death. And I'm absolutely sure that's a sign that it was unfinished. I think he would have put a little scene in just to help Timon have a rest.
That's a great first folio point, because you're absolutely right. Timon was not meant to be in the first folio. Troilus and Cressida was. That guy we've already heard about, because he's trying to sell it in 2 different ways. He is not keen to give up the rights, and so they think, we're not going to get Troilus and Cressida. We've got a big hole in our book. How are we going to do this? And they get Timon of Athens from somewhere and pop it in. There is no other reference to Timon of Athens before the folio. So if that hadn't happened, this play would have not just been lost, but would have been in Donald Rumsfeld's wonderful way a completely unknown. We would not have known it existed at all, because there is no other reference to it. And that's a really interesting point, because it reminds us how fragile the canon is. Actually, there are at least two plays by Shakespeare that we don't have. Love's Labour's 1, which was clearly in print in the beginning of the 17th century and has been lost, and Cardenio, a Don Quixote play collaboratively with Fletcher, which has also been lost. And the Timon of Athens sort of sliding doors moment makes me think there could have been more.
Yeah,
I think that's Middleton, probably.
or Shakespeare going,
maybe
what?
What did he
I
say?
write less well than Middleton. We ought to talk a little bit about how the... I just want to talk a little bit about how we use the folio as actors, because when we're at school, I only came to this very late in my career. When we're at school, we assume that the text we're given is the text, don't we? And it never occurred to me. I had done 20 years before I suddenly realised that I might have heard vague things about quartos and folios and whatever, but I suddenly realised that these what you call fragile texts, that they're not set in stone, and it's quite a big question, this, for performers, because it allows us the excuse to play around, I think, because if you're given Timon, which doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make any sense. And when we did it, we did all sorts of terrible things, like we added lines from Coriolanus. And the last line, I can't remember what the last line in the folio is, but it's not a great ending. So I remember in the rehearsal room, Nick Hytner, the director, said to the stage manager, we had computers with us, can you just look up any line in Shakespeare that has the word peace in it? Because frankly, at the end of this terrible story, what we're looking for is peace. Athens is looking for peace. And lo and behold, the stage manager came up and we ended up with As You Like It. So our Timon of Athens ended up with a line from As You Like It. And it's that sort of sense of, they're not steady anyway. So frankly, we might as well collaborate, actually. And things like, I didn't realise until, as I say, late on, that I have a choice if I play Lear. For instance, I have a choice between how to die in Lear. And it's a big choice. It's a big difference, because the first version of Lear has him die with a heart breaking. Rather conventional line, my heart is breaking, which in a later edition is given to Kent, his great loyal servant, and we get what I think is the great version of that play, of him looking at the corpse of his dead daughter, look there, and all that sort of stuff. And it's just an amazing thing that you've got this choice that as an actor you have to make. And one is, in my mind, in that particular case, one is emotionally complex and interesting, and the other is not so interesting. And we think, don't we, that Shakespeare probably did the rewrites between the quarto and the folio. Is that right?
Yeah, so one of the things Hemmings and Condell tell us in the... I alternate between Hemming, sometimes it is Hemming and sometimes Hemmings. Everybody's names are up for grabs really in this period. All the signatures of Shakespeare we've got are spelt differently.
Shakespeare.
Yeah, Shakespeare. Hemmings and Condell say, we've got all the works here gathered together for the first time, complete in their absolute in their numbers. And they say, before you were abused with diverse stolen and surreptitious copies. So they tried to diss really effectively all the ones that have already been in print. I think probably again as part of the marketing of this book to say, you may, because we all know how annoying it is to have to buy something you've already got in order to get something you haven't got. That's a kind of way that things are packaged up, which is sort of disproportionately annoying as a consumer. And so I think Hemming and Condell are trying to say, you may, if you're a keen playgoer or interested in plays, you probably own quite a lot of these titles already, but these are better. So it's still worth having. But they also say, which relates to what Simon's just said, they're all completely correct, because when we looked at the author's manuscripts, there was never a blot in his papers. There's a great
Johnson quote, yeah. Is what you say, yeah.
Yeah.
I would there had been, isn't it?
Yeah, but Johnson said, would he had blotted thousands,
Yeah.
But it's a way of presenting Shakespeare as a sort of genius figure, and it all just comes out in a perfect piece, which is so clearly, not even how genius is right, Everybody rewrites and rethinks, not attuned to the theatre and the kind of collaborative work, but also threw us off the scent, really, that Shakespeare might, like any other serious writer, have wanted to revise his work.
So what's the academic consensus, if there is one, in Shakespeare studies, on, for instance, the three versions of Hamlet? I mean, because Hamlet had two quartos, quarto one and quarto two. Quarto one was used to be known as the bad quarto. Short lines we don't recognise, like "to be or not to be I, there's the point," which is the beginning of that famous speech. Quarto two is the longest version of Hamlet we have, the most complete version, and then the Folio is shorter, missing a couple of significant moments.
Yeah.
So what's the academic consensus on that? I mean, are they all? What I'm saying is, are they all valid versions of a performed text at the time?
I think probably the consensus on those texts is that they each represent a version of the play at some point in its life. So I think we now think of play scripts. Maybe we think of the plays we study as scripts rather than texts or something.
So we get rid of the word bad, for instance.
We get rid of the word bad. We say these were all there are ways of explaining the existence of these texts. If you work on a new play now in the theatre, you would know that it would go through different stages, and maybe what Print has done is to freeze some of these stages, perhaps kind of at random, really, maybe not necessarily absolutely in a considered way. Then there's the other point, which I think has been left hanging a bit, which is in scholarship, which is about revision. So we came with great fanfare to think, Shakespeare revised King Lear, and so that the quarto text 1608 and the first folio 1623 seem substantially different. We like them both, so we think. I mean, we don't have any external evidence for this, so this is all generating out of the texts, and there is an element of saying these are both really good. So the easiest solution to that is to say they're both by Shakespeare.
And both of equal value.
They're both of equal value, whereas we don't think that so much about a longer, shorter and a longer text of Romeo and Juliet, say, Merry Wives of Windsor. So we tend to give a different explanation for those.
Because the Hamlet one's when we did Hamlet, because in the Folio, which is I'd say the second longest version, so you've got Q2, which is big, you've got Quarto 2, and then you've got the slightly shorter Folio, and it's missing the famous speech, "How all occasions do inform against me," which is his fourth soliloquy, Hamlet's fourth soliloquy, something like that. And I always remember thinking, that's interesting, that's gone. And my theory, which is completely unsupported by any scholarship, was that Shakespeare thought, this speech is redundant. Because actually, if you do the speech, you're just repeating sort of what you were saying in around about his first soliloquy, this too solid flesh would melt. You're sort of repeating the same argument with a bit of stuff about war in it, but otherwise, basically, his state of mind doesn't seem to have moved on. And you're thinking, we've had nearly 2 hours of drama in which he's gone through a lot of things. He's not in that same state of mind. It always occurred to me that I wonder whether Shakespeare sat there thinking, I've already said this. He's in a different place. He's just about to go off to England.
That's so interesting, because I was about to say it's a dangerous precedent, isn't it, to say in Hamlet, maybe we've had this before and so we won't have it. I mean, that could produce a very, very short play.
Yes.
But your sense that specifically doesn't recognise a new kind of turn to action.
Yes, and
that's really interesting.
I don't know. It always felt we did do it. I don't know. Did we ever do it early on in the rehearsal period? I remember thinking, he's a different man from the person who did How All Occasions. This too solid flesh would melt. I mean, it's a bit like, actually, fun enough, and this is nothing to do with the Folio really, but the idea that to be or not to be seems to be in the wrong place. It's when Benedict Cumberbatch recently did his performance of Hamlet, and they switched it to the beginning, of the whole thing, obviously because it's the most famous speech in the play. Just get it out the way. But there was lots of outcry about that. And I remember thinking, you know something? I might not do it at the very beginning of the play, but where it is at the moment doesn't really fit.
Which is partly why, I mean, sometimes you see actors doing it knowing that it's being overheard.
Yes.
So that it's not a...
It's also theatrical. There's a theatrical reason for this. I don't know, except for Malvolio, perhaps. I don't know many people, many characters in Shakespeare's plays who come onto an already populated stage and then start a soliloquy without acknowledging the people already there. Most soliloquies seem to come at the end of scenes, beginning
Everybody
of
else
scenes.
has gone, yeah.
Everybody else has gone. But that's a very odd one, and the only one I can think of is Malvolio coming, and then of course the first thing he does is pick up a letter. It's just a very odd thing for Hamlet to come on and not two people scuttling off to hide, and Ophelia still sitting there, and then I don't know.
And then to recognise her at the end.
And then to recognise, oh my gosh,
she hasn't really done anything different.
There you are. It's just theatrically.
Yeah, it makes much more sense that he knows that they're there and he's spinning this.
And there's also, I mean, I can't remember the arguments that we had, but I remember thinking it's also psychologically. No, did I think it was earlier or later? I think I probably thought it was earlier. Psychologically, that he was still in his sort of suicidal mode. Whereas by the time he gets to Ophelia, he's getting a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more. Anyway, that's not a Folio question really, but it's just a moment when you think, on the sheer practicalities of moving this text around the stage, some things come up and you think, and I'm absolutely sure, I'm sure this is a person who played Hamlet with a certain amount of weight on him. But I'm absolutely sure that, again with no evidence, that when Shakespeare got Hamlet's mother to say during the fight, he's fat and scant of breath, I'm absolutely sure that Shakespeare was looking at Burbage thinking, blimey, on his 100th performance, I think we've got to say something, haven't we? And, you know, he's pretending to be a 30-year-old and he's a bit, and he added it.
Well, it is a kind of Folio question in a way, because it's I mean, it both reminds us that these are scripts with a theatrical life and for theatre, which have been, for some reason and for some variety of reasons, fixed in a book to be read, and that's distorted them in certain ways.
What you said at the beginning is that the moment it starts going into the study.
Yeah.
I mean, they're both valid. I mean, aren't they? They're both valid responses to whatever that written word is, whether it's heard or read, isn't it? But it's, I mean, as I say, one of the great things that's happened over the last 40 years is that we talk now. Yeah. And there's a whole performance criticism school, isn't there? That come up and says actually that great actor's response to that line is actually, because I've always thought this is that any performance is in itself an addition. Yeah. Or certainly a critical response, and you have to make editorial choices, don't you? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Jan, should we be making a time for some questions, do you think?
Oh God, questions.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
The mic's under my chair. Of course.
I've forgotten questions.
You're talking about the history and what was Shakespeare doing when he wrote it and who really wrote it. How much is it important, you know, how much you just take the page, what's on the page, and how much is this much wider understanding of the context important?
I certainly think when I started, I didn't do any reading round. And in fact, in the history plays, it was frankly not of much use, really. And certainly if you play Richard III, it's of no use at all. So things like that I probably didn't do. I think in terms of and I've talked about this, but when I did Lear, I did do some research into dementia because I just thought it was there was something bugging me about the fact that it seemed to be a very accurate series of symptoms that Lear was showing. And I thought, I bet he's seen somebody who sees animals, for instance, or loses the train of his thought and can't find a word, and all those sort of things that seem to be specifically to do with dementia. And I got my young nephew, young medical student, to do the research for me, and he came up with this particular type of dementia. So but that's unusual. I don't often look outside to, in terms of the history of the plays themselves. I've got more and more interested in that, and that is useful. I think it is useful to know. We've talked about the middle period plays, where I think he seemed to be in a bit of trouble, Shakespeare, just creatively sort of chewing at stuff and beginning to collaborate with people like Middleton and whatever. That I think is actually useful for the actor to know. I mean, it's not essential, but I think it gives a sense of the darkening world of Shakespeare at that particular point, I think. But most of it actually is for my own. I just find it completely fascinating. I mean, the thing is, you've got two Arden editors here, by the way. You've got a big grown-up one here, but I'm doing a version for performance for Arden, which is actually simplifying the whole the layout of the page, and literally just gives options for words. And that, I think, is a fascinating process, because you again, the text becomes febrile and fragile and sort of uncertain, and it allows you. One of the famous ones is that this too solid flesh, sullied flesh, sallied flesh. And again, there's a performance question that comes in, because I decided on solid only because that's the simplest on the ear for comprehension immediately. Solid flesh melting. It might be in the study much more interesting to have sullied flesh melting, but I just thought in the theatre it just needs that immediate comprehension. So solid flesh melting, and literally I looked at my hands and the solid flesh. So those sort of choices you make as an editorial choice. And also they're the lines, of course, I love the fact there's certain lines that are completely invented, like Falstaff babbling of green fields, which is my favourite, invented by Tybalt, wasn't it? Mm. Yeah.
Yeah. In the Folio, it's table.
Oh, table of green babes or something. Yeah. So then,
I think the microphone will come forward to you, so we're just going to take one more, and then I'll bring it to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tom Velleley. I'm actually the assistant director of this term's instalment of the Jesus College Shakespeare Project.
Hooray.
And for those who aren't aware, we aim to perform every single one of Shakespeare's plays once per term over the coming years. And this term we're doing Henry VI Part 1 on Friday the 25th and Saturday the 26th. So you all know about it now. You've got to buy tickets. There's no excuse. But we're currently rehearsing Henry VI Part 1, and we're doing Part 2, Part 3, and then Richard III as a kind of tetralogy. And I wanted to ask you both about the kind of dramatic staging of that, because Emma, you've written on the contrast between Richard III and the Henry VI plays, and how it's much easier to stage something that has kind of one charismatic character like Richard III that you can kind of, focus the play around, rather than something like Henry VI, which is an ensemble piece. So I was wondering if either of you had any dramatic advice on how to give focus and urgency to an ensemble piece like the Henry VI plays.
The Talbot play. You do Henry VI, I'm not.
Well, you're absolutely right that, in terms of Shakespeare's writing, Shakespeare and others probably writing this series, Richard III is the play where he decides to organise both the politics, the fiction, and the dramaturgy around a single figure. So Richard III is an experiment in actually a sort of almost a one-man show. And it's, what's that like theatrically? What's that like ethically and politically? What's that like, in terms of the governance of the kingdom and the stage? But Henry VI plays, you're right, have got they're about the kind of melee from which this one argument would be from which this kind of fascistic dictator emerges. So they're precisely about the difficulty in knowing who you should root for, who you should put your trust in, who is on the way up. It's really very unsettling as an audience. And I think a bad version of that is a kind of parody of our anxiety that we probably all feel when we go to Shakespeare, which is, oh God, maybe I'm just not going to understand it. And I'm just going to sit here and think, I don't know what you're talking about and I don't know who you are. And I wish it were the
Another
interval.
county called after a county.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
That's Monty Python.
So I think you don't want to do that, and I know that you won't do that in your production. But I think you want some sense that this is an unstable world, and we don't really know who to follow or where to be, because that does seem to me the point of them, and it's one of the reasons that Part 1 is so invested in Talbot, because Talbot seems to offer that a more. We can all hold on to him. He's heroic. He's winning. He's English. He's going to win the battle. Great. Let's hold on to that. But then that's sort of taken away from us. But
you do still have the stars, don't you? I mean, you've got, as you say, Talbot, and then you've got Duke of York, and then you've got Margaret, and you know what I mean. They are stars located in there, aren't they? Circling around each other.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, for example, the fact that you keep Margaret in Richard III when the historic figure was dead, that suggests there's a star character.
And I love the idea that, and I'd never thought of this, that it's preparing the way for the rise of the horror. And God knows we see that now. And just a little story. When I first joined the Royal Shakespeare Company, actually, they did a version, 3-evening version of the Henrys and Richard III, so they squashed it together. And the first time I ever met Ray Fiennes doing Henry VI. And they were doing a rehearsal, and they'd done the first 2 Henrys. And Anton Lesser, the great Anton Lesser, was playing Richard III in the 3rd play, and had already obviously been doing his bit as Duke of Gloucester. And as a joke, at the end of the dress rehearsal, they went blah 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 blah, and they crowned Edward IV, and they went and everything stopped, and Anton just turned and went, "Now," like that. And, I can't tell you, I was in the dress rehearsal, and it was just a joke, but it was so good as an idea, and I'm sure it's been probably done before, probably been done since, but as an idea of just, as you say, the preparation of the ground. And then it was like the great populist politician going, yes. And of course it's the first line of, now is the writer's container.
I know that there are more questions, but I'm terribly sorry. I'm told by my colleagues that we have to end. However, I know that everybody's going to be here for tea. Well, I hope that everybody's going to be here for tea. So you will have many opportunities to speak to these very fine people over tea. And I'm terribly sorry. It's been such a treat. And whilst I wasn't concentrating, I am going to watch it online later. And it's such a pleasure to have so many people from all over the universe joining us this afternoon.
Yes, let's wave that down.
Thank you. Thank you.